Okay, so we are officially recording, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. If you have any trouble, go ahead and send a message in the chat. You can send it either to everyone or to CCS to have it go to the CCS staff who are in the other room available to support if needed. I'm going to jump right in with our agenda. If I can find my mouse. Okay, so today we are going to cover the projects that are remaining in terms of configuration. We're going to go over the documentation that CCS is working on and what you can expect from us and when. And that's an opportunity to make some additional requests in the chat or ask questions about what we're planning as well. And then we're going to spend quite a bit of time going over the Go Live schedule and what we anticipate will happen around Go Live. If you do have an individual library meeting set up or a visit with a CCS staff member, that Go Live schedule will review in-house as well. We're also going to cover what's going to happen after April 17th. So just because we're on Polaris doesn't mean we're done with training and projects and Polaris-related work. So we'll go over some of the things we have queued up. And then we will move on to an offline circulation demo. So this is our project schedule. We've been going over this at all of our quarterly webinars. We've been through project planning, system configuration, and we are now nearing the end of training, testing, and configuration. So we're going to talk a little bit about what's left to do in these next few weeks and then focus on that Go Live prep. In terms of configuration, while the system as a whole is configured, there's a lot of additional areas that we are continuing to work on. So one of the big pieces that have just come up are permissions. Until Monday, everybody who was using Polaris was lumped into this training permission group that had really wide-ranging permissions, and we were able to do just about everything in the system except for system administration. We know that's not how most libraries work, so we've created a lot of different permission groups to help libraries categorize their staff members and give them the individual, give each individual the permissions they need to do their job successfully. We've applied those permissions to each user, and they went into effect on Monday. And we've already got a number of tickets in, which is great. We have about a month that we can go and test all of these users and permissions and make sure that all library staff have what they need to do their job. So we are aware of some issues, and we are working to address them as quickly as possible so you can continue your training without any issues in the library. Again, if you have any questions about permissions or want to report an issue, if you're not sure if it's an issue, always email help@ccslib.org, and that will go to all CCS staff through our ticket system. Our next project is revising the notice text and having a notice text test day. Symphony and Polaris notices work really differently, so we are working with Polaris staff to make sure that when we set up a notice test day, and we're targeting the end of March, that we don't affect any patrons. A lot of you will have noticed that in PowerPack, for example, users can't select all of the notice types that they'll have available to them because we didn't turn on all of the options, so we could avoid the system accidentally generating some notices. So by the end of March, we want to have those set up and configured and do a test with a subset of library staff to make sure that the notices are delivered as expected and that we're happy with the performance. We have a page on our portal that covers the different notice options that are available and for which notice types each option is available. So I'd recommend reviewing that page. By popular demand, we're also working on kind of more of a graphic flowchart view of how notices work. And then we'll also be adding to our patron communication a more patron-facing explanation of notices, what options are available to them and how can they select them. And that we'll have to configure, or we'll provide sort of a template, and library by library, you'll want to make sure that that's in line with your practices and share that with your patrons through your own communication tools. So in addition to working on PowerPack customization, we're also setting up online fine payment through PowerPack. So actually, later today, each library will be getting a list of merchant accounts that they can set up, and that will be going to library directors, business managers, whoever at each library is going to handle that configuration. So our target is to have that up and tested before go live so your patrons can continue to pay fines online without any issues. E-content configuration is another piece that is going to require some additional work before we're up and ready to go. We have both integrated and non-integrated e-content that we need to configure. Integrated e-content are those titles that we're going to be able to download directly through PowerPack, so similar to eResource Central and Enterprise. That includes Overdrive, all of your consortial Advantage or standalone Overdrive accounts, 3M's Cloud Library, as well as Baker & Taylor's Access 360. So much like now, users will be able to access that content in PowerPack, download those titles directly to their device, and start enjoying them with that single logon situation. We will be working with each vendor to configure those different groups, so your patrons will have access to the titles that you've licensed and won't be confused by titles that they don't have access to, just like the current setup in eResource Central. One way that Polaris is different than Symphony in this case is that the records that are in PowerPack are going to be the same records that are in the staff client. So right now we're kind of dealing with two different sets of records when we're talking about ebooks, and that will be a lot more streamlined in Polaris. Staff and patrons will see the same content whether they're looking in the staff client or in Leap or in PowerPack. So that's a nice change that we're looking forward to. We also have some options for how to manage non-integrated e-content, and non-integrated e-content are resources that you maybe want to have a MARC record for in the catalog to help your patrons with discovery, but they can't download directly through PowerPack. This might be an individual database like, oh, we have lynda.com. That might be something you want to look at. Or they could be titles like your Gale Virtual Reference Library ebook titles. And Polaris has a tool called resource groups that can allow libraries and CCS to sort of manage those titles on a library by library basis and ensure that, again, they're displaying appropriately to the patron and they're getting pushed to the right logon page when they do have to do that external non-integrated logon to access that resource. So we are working on that configuration, and we'll be sharing some timelines on when you can expect those non-integrated pieces within the next couple of weeks. The timeline in terms of the integrated pieces, we are starting with the configuration for Baker & Taylor Access 360, and then we will be configuring Cloud Library, and we are saving Overdrive, save the best for last, I guess, or the biggest for last, until we upgrade to the next version of Polaris, which should be in mid-March. So Overdrive integration is coming. We're just waiting for the next version of Polaris to fix a bug that we need fixed. Questions on e-content, you can go ahead and shoot those into the chat. I know that was sort of a very high-level overview. I just want to assure you that we will have e-content integration, and it is coming. Okay. We're also working on publishing reports to the client or modifying some of the existing canned reports that are there. We've divided our reports into sort of 3 separate tiers. Tier 1 reports are those reports that library staff need to kind of access every day in order to do their jobs. So we want to have those available as soon as possible so you can test them, know where to access them, and be confident that you are going to be using the right report on April 17th if you need to access that. I'm going to pause for a minute. It looks like we have a chat about e-content, so I don't want to get too far away. So we have a question that says, in CIRCE we had to have separate links and MARC records. Do we have to do that in Polaris? Yes. So each library has a separate sort of logon URL and the resource groups will help manage the display of those URLs to patrons so they don't show up 24 times in the pack. And I'll pause for a minute here in case Kathy wants to jump in with any. Yep, Kathy says I'm correct. All right, thank you, Kathy. So we will still have those 856 with URLs in them, and resource groups will help us manage those. So you don't need to change your current practice at this time. In terms of reports, again, we're going to be publishing reports kind of in 3 sections. Tier 1 reports, we are shooting for having ready for you in early March. Some other reports you'll need after go live, but maybe not on the first day. So we want to have those ready for you by the end of April. And then there are other reports that, you know, would be nice to have within the first quarter or 3 months from go live, but aren't necessarily mission critical to getting your job done on day 1. So those we have scheduled a little bit later out. We're also working to kind of redevelop and relaunch web reports. It's a really nice tool that you can use to access your statistical reports and monthly reports without having to go into the client. And we've gotten a lot of questions about web reports and its potential longevity. So we want to do what we can to make that tool available for library staff moving forward. So that we will be working on a little bit later in the summer, but that's one of our higher priority projects. So we're not necessarily going to recreate every report that's in web reports right now by like April 30th, because we know that web reports will be coming for you within the summer. We'll also be, in relaunching web reports, looking to add some additional documentation and sort of helper text to make sure that on reports that you need to take an action, that action is clearly outlined for you, which reports are just informational, and making sure you have the data you need to or the information you need to interpret the data within the report. So we will be kind of partnering on that between member services and IT over the next few months. Okay, I'm going to do another pause for questions. We have more configuration stuff coming up, so if I didn't hit your project, got some more. Okay. We're also working with Collection HQ to make sure that each library that is using Collection HQ has the extract set up and scheduled and kind of mapped on the Collection HQ side so they can continue receiving their Collection HQ reports. Each Collection HQ library will have a phone call with Collection HQ, and those have already started for at least one library, maybe 2, to make sure that everything's set up and ready to go as close to go live as possible. So that configuration is in the works. We're also, we have another question in the chat. I indicated that there are 3 tiers of reports. So what's in the second and third tier? Second and third tier reports are more like a weeding report, for example. Everyone needs to do weeding and be able to access those reports, but if you can't pull a weeding report on April 17th, that's not necessarily going to be a big impact to the patron, as opposed to like your failed call reports or things like that that you need to follow up on day 1 with patrons. We have that list, and we can add it to the slides before we post the slides so everyone can take a look at that as well. So Tier 1 reports are those reports that if library staff don't have access to them on the first day or can't take action on them, it will severely impact their workflow or will impact patrons. And then Tier 2 are those reports that you need for sort of ongoing activity. And then Tier 3 reports are those that are informational or nice to have, and key for cleanup or making sure material is being added to the collection properly. In terms of receipts and labels, we've released some documentation about receipt and label printer configuration, and we've been getting a lot of questions, so we're working on some additional information to share with libraries to help facilitate your configuration on your end. we've done some initial config at the system level, but there are some pieces, as noted in the documentation, that each library needs to address as well. Label manager is new for us. It's a sort of different label process than in Symfony, so Kathy is working on some documentation on how to set that up if you like to print your labels within the system. So that is forthcoming, and we're going to talk in more depth about documentation in a couple of minutes, but we are continuing to troubleshoot receipts and labels with libraries. It sounds like we had a successful review of receipt printing at the CIRC meeting, and we're able to solve some problems about extra spacing on printer label or on receipts. So if you have any issues continuing with your receipt printers, please send us a note. We've also had a question if anyone has templates and printed labels in Polaris. I don't see the answer to that. I don't think many libraries have those yet within CCS. Certainly libraries outside CCS have been using the label manager within Polaris. So that chat came privately to chime in about their experience with Polaris labels in the chat, and everyone, that's fine. We've got a guy coming up so we can talk additionally. Oh, okay, having some audio issues. Can you hear me now? So just to repeat what I said previously, we went over receipt printing at the CIRC meeting, and we can talk more about label printing at the upcoming CAM meeting. We had a chat that came in that asked if any libraries within CCS have set up their label printers yet, and I don't know the answer to that. So if anyone wants to add in chat that they have successfully configured their labels, that would be great. We have another follow-up question that will we be able to have two printers attached to the receipt labels? Winnetka has configured their labels. Highland Park is testing their labels, so that is good. Way to go, guys. We have a question about can we have two printers attached? Yes, depending on your workstation and what your responsibilities are, you can have two printers set up. If you print both receipts and labels, you can also have your 8.5 by 11, and in the staff client, that's all a little bit more seamless than working in Leap. If you're printing labels, I don't know that labels can be printed in Leap. CCS staff, do you know if there's any label printing functionality yet in Leap? No labels in Leap yet. So if you're using Leap, labels are not an issue for you. We have another question that documentation is coming on how to fix the blank space in receipt printers. Yes, we will send documentation on how to fix the blank space on receipt printers. CCS, do we have a date on that? Friday. So that will go out. In terms of the complete minutes for the CIRC meeting, we'll have to check in with the CIRC group secretary, but we'll have the information on the receipt printer configuration out on Friday to everyone. Get a couple questions on that. So we are hearing you loud and clear that receipts and labels are tricky. So we are answering questions as they come in, and where we're getting repeated questions or seeing issues that affect everyone, like the spacing on the receipt printers, we are sharing that information out and will continue to do so. We're also working on ongoing pack customization. This is another area where we've been asked for another sort of resource in terms of documentation, just to help clarify which tasks are CCS tasks and which tasks are library tasks. With Enterprise, individual libraries had kind of more direct access to some of their pack customization, and in Polaris, CCS has to be a little bit more involved given the way the system is built. So we're trying to clarify that to make sure everyone understands what the different pieces are. and who's responsible for them. But we've had a lot of libraries do some successful pack customization so far. We had a question come up, like, can we change our mind on pack customization? And the answer is yes, absolutely. If you want to, if your library changes a logo in the future and you want to upload a new logo, we can work with you on that. If you want to change your web parts, like your book carousels or maybe some dashboard pieces, thematically, like if you've got summer reading and you want to have some themed lists, we can work with you on that. This is not a one and done, your pack is customized and after the deadline we can make no additional changes. So this is new for us too, this sort of having CCS so involved. So we certainly want to work with libraries to make sure that you're getting the information that you need and that your pack work is being completed in a way that's going to be good for you and your patrons. So watch for that additional documentation. We had a question earlier today also about that pack customization deadline of this Friday. We've asked for pack customization information to all be into CCS so we can prioritize and get that work done. We understand there's been some confusion about certain components and we need to issue some clarification. So if that pushes that deadline out a little bit for a few libraries, that's fine. It's just a question of getting everything in as soon as possible so we can complete the work. As we'll talk about in the Go Live schedule, which we get to a little bit later, we have to stop making changes in a pretty early April if we want those changes to be reflected in production. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we move forward. We're also working with StackMap for our StackMap libraries on some troubleshooting. They've provided us with the code. They've sent CCS the code for all of the StackMap libraries, and we are working on testing and getting that set up with one library first, and then once it's working for them, we'll input that code for the rest of the StackMap libraries. So until you hear from CCS staff, or unless you hear from CCS staff, you don't have to take any action with StackMap. Okay, so acquisitions configuration is also an ongoing piece that's going to have to continue work after Go Live. We have asked for libraries to submit any planned changes to their acquisitions practice to CCS or to confirm that they're not making any changes, so we can make sure that we're prepared to offer you the support that you need and also to coordinate between Polaris and each library. For those libraries that'll be working and setting up EDI, Polaris will be scheduling a call with each of those libraries to go over the vendors and the EDI setup and to get a lot of that work done. That setup can't happen until after Go Live because it doesn't transfer during the migration. So those calls and setup will happen depending on the library and their timeline after April 17th. So that survey went out about 2 weeks ago, and it's been in, it was in last week's newsletter as well. If you could just let us know what your plans are. We've put a March 15th deadline on that to give you time if you hadn't fully decided what you're going to do. We're just asking if you're planning any changes, and if so, to kind of outline them a little bit and your rough timeline, whether it's this fiscal year or next fiscal year, so again, we can plan the support that we need to provide to you. Okay. Each library should have also received from our IT staff an email outlining their SIP tools, their SIP connected tools. There were 2 sections of that email. One section outlined which vendors CCS would work with to say, we're going to stop at Go Live to say, Symphony is no longer accurate. Here's the information you need to point to Polaris. And a lot of vendors were willing to work with us, and we can coordinate that on the 17th and 18th to make sure that we're pointing at the right server. There were some vendors that either needed additional information from us or couldn't work directly with CCS for another reason. So those have been sent in that same email to each library outlining which vendors they need to contact to say, hey, we're no longer using Symfony. Here's the Polaris information. Please point your tool here. That email also contained the SIP port information, the SIP user, and the details that you'll need to share with your SIP connected vendors to get that transition set up. Any questions on any of these pieces? Taking a long pause to give you time to type. Okay. So some additional projects that we're sort of starting work on now, but will not be ready for go live. These are sort of bridging the gap between before and after. The first and sort of the biggest is the call number split. As you can see on the picture here, Polaris has several call number fields, including prefix, classification, cutter, and suffix that did not exist in Symfony. In Symfony, all of the call number information, with the exception of volume and copy, was stored in one field without any subfields or way for us to split it up. This doesn't create a problem in Polaris except for the patron, because whether the call number is in several fields or one field, it displays appropriately to the patron in PowerPack. The volume information is also separated out, so the volume information is already taken care of and already lives in the volume field in Polaris as appropriate. And that's important for holds management and placing holds on different kinds of material. What we want to do is be able to split your call numbers into prefix, classification, cutter, and suffix to aid you in your reporting and to make sure that moving forward with your data entry, your call numbers are all consistent. So we'll be working with libraries to set up the criteria on how we're going to do that split, and what the difference, to make sure that we understand on your end what you're classifying as a prefix and what you're classifying as a classification. It's a lot of classifies. So we'll be working with libraries on that. We will not be making any changes to your call numbers without talking to you about it. But we are starting work on this project now, sort of in preliminary planning, and we hope to wrap it up by the end of July. I know it sounds like a long time, but we just want to make sure we have ample time for consulting and testing since we'll be developing this process. This is something that Polaris has available, but it was their splitting process couldn't take into account kind of all of the variances across our libraries and would have left us with a lot of cleanup and maybe not the tools we needed to do it. So this should be a cleaner process. I have three questions. What is the difference between SIP and API? So tools can connect and integrate with Symfony in a couple of different ways. A SIP connection is, I don't want to say less integrated, but a SIP connection just sort of like sends information back and forth, and there's a standard set of fields that it can send back and forth to each other. The API is more that tools were developed to work with each other. I'm not doing a great job of explaining this, but for our purposes, we're sort of lumping them together as two different kinds of tools that need to be integrated and tested. So an example of a SIP connection is when you log on to a computer in the library and your computer management system says, yep, that's a real patron, they can log on. And then an example of integration with API, Communico, the Communico app that sort of has tentacles that reach into various areas, uses API. I have a message from a library that they didn't receive some information about 3M self-check, so I'm going to make a note to follow up on that, and you should get an email from me after this meeting. Making a note. Okay. And then a question about call numbers. In Symphony, we had to do a subfield Z in call numbers to help with holds for multi-volume records when we need to do something differently in the Polaris staff client. Yes and no. So you won't have to put in subfield Z, but whatever you would have put in subfield Z, you will instead put in the field called volume. So the same practices will apply, but instead of putting it instead of writing in the same field classification subfield Z, disk 1-2, you would put disk 1-2 in the volume field. So your existing volume information will have migrated to that volume field and can show you as an example of how you need to enter that moving forward, and we'll make sure we include that in our forthcoming documentation as well. So the call number split is coming up, and we'll be talking a lot more about what those pieces are with our tech services staff members. We'll also be working on, and this is really more of a post-go live project, community profiles and feature it. We had an initial webinar on these tools, and these are both also they sort of bridge between tech services and public services. They're special records that we can put into Polaris that will pop up in the pack to help your patrons identify resources that are maybe not traditional library resources. So Feature It can help you promote your databases. If someone does a search for consumer reports and you also have the electronic access to consumer reports, you can have a special box pop up that says that there's another tool that you may want to research. Similarly, community profiles can help you feature your own events or community events. So we'll talk a lot more about those features and how to use them. We had pretty low turnout at our first webinars, but we think that after learning more about them and getting a little bit more settled in Polaris, we'll have some libraries eager to use these tools. So watch for more information about that. Again, we'll be working to set up sort of a new version of web reports post-go live, kind of in mid-summer, to kind of bring together all of those canned reports and reduce the need for people to log into the staff client only to access reports. We know a lot of you need the staff client to do your work. Community profiles and Feature It, for example, are managed through the staff client. But for maybe folks in circulation whose only interaction with the staff client is to use reports, if we can meet your needs in web reports, we want to do that as well. We want to do that instead. The next section that I want to talk about is more about documentation and what you can expect from us, but I want to pause here for additional questions about kind of work remaining to be done or features maybe that you have questions about when they'll be implemented. All right, so I'm going to move on then. We have started kind of revamping the migration portal to include sort of more traditionally sequential documentation. We've got a lot of great information up there right now in different posts and in our newsletters, but we know that long term you need sort of a one-stop shop for where you're going to pick up all of your documentation. So this is an incomplete list of the documentation that we are working on for you, and I want to pause for a minute and pop over to the portal to show you what one of these pages will look like. So 1 second. Okay, so here we are on the portal. I'm going to log in, and I have my shared username and password saved. And you can see I have a new tab here called Polaris Procedures. Right now there's only a public services tab, but we will of course have a technical services tab as well. And when you click on this, we've been using public services as sort of our umbrella term for circulation, fiction, reference, audiovisual, youth services, teen services, whatever patron-facing departments you have in your library, we've been sort of broadly referring to as public services. So this isn't just PASS. But this page will give you a good sense of what the technical services page will look like as well. So we've grouped documentation into some different areas. So again, if we're talking about public service being both circulation and maybe readers advisory departments, there's different tasks you'll need to do. So if I really focus on placing holds and managing holds and doing searching, I can jump right to those sections that are going to be most relevant to me. The documentation that we have drafted is here and is already linked, but this page will show you also what we have coming down the pipeline that just isn't ready for review yet. So these documents are here and you can start looking at them now. We've tried to keep on these pages the sidebars to a minimum so you can easily print them if you want to print them. I will say as we have new releases of Polaris and maybe new features added, we're going to be updating these pages and including notes of when they were last updated. So if you are someone who likes to print your documentation, I would strongly recommend that you also bookmark these pages and revisit them, especially after upgrades, to make sure that you're working from the most current version. So with all of our documentation, we are trying to include ample screenshots so you can see what we're seeing and eliminate communication errors. On this page also, you'll notice that the sort of sidebar we do have are the related 2-minute tutorials. So you can still access the full list of 2-minute tutorials either by going to our YouTube channel or the 2-minute tutorial page. But as you're thinking about training and documentation, you can easily see, oh, here are the basics I have 2-minute tutorials for. As we're continuing to build our documentation, we are focusing on areas that we don't already have tutorials built. So you'll notice that holds maintenance, we don't have the documentation prepped yet, the written documentation, because we already have the 2-minute tutorial available to you in LEAP and the related handout, whereas modifying item circulation status has no tutorial. So we're trying to keep those kind of balanced, although we will fill in all of the gaps. So again, this is just the patron-facing or the public services page. We will have a very similar layout and documentation for technical services as well. Yes, and we do have some 2-minute tutorials that are focused on the staff client and some that are focused on LEAP. So those are noted where there could be confusion about that. And when we're talking about public services, almost all of the public services functions that we are going to talk about just in general and moving forward are always going to be LEAP-based, whereas technical services is still pretty highly tied to the client. So that's a good clue to whether the documentation is going to be LEAP or staff client. So I'd strongly recommend that you start checking this page out. Again, we've got a lot more coming in terms of documentation. One of the next pieces that we'll be publishing is sort of our complete guide to offline circ, and that will be coming March 16th. Most of the documentation that we have listed, and I'll switch back to PowerPoint. All of the documentation here is planned for release prior to go live, but we know that we're going to continue to learn about the software and learn about all of its features after go live. So we'll, one, make updates, as I noted, and make sure we always note the most recent updated date on any documentation. And two, just adding new features or creating new documentation for areas that, are maybe more specific or advanced that we want to add in later. So watch for all of that within the next several weeks. And if you have questions about the documentation that's coming, or you have a request for something that, no matter how many times you watch the webinar or read the existing documentation or reviewed the help file, you just isn't clicking, please let us know and we can add it to our list. So if there are no additional questions about documentation, I want to talk about the Go Live schedule. Again, if we've been out to your library in the past couple of months or are coming soon, this is a section we'll review with you at that time. But I think it cannot hurt to go over it multiple times. So when I'm thinking about Go Live, I've divided that sort of Go Live prep and Go Live period into 4 different phases. First, we need to complete data testing, and we're already in this section. We're working in this purple world right now. We'll also be working with Polaris to configure the production server, and then we'll have to do another Symphony data extraction and load to Polaris production, and then we'll be live on Polaris. And we're going to walk through each of these steps and the related deadlines. So in terms of completing the data testing, as I said, we're sort of already in the thick of this. Friday, February 2nd was the last day to request new policies like shelf locations, and Polaris is working on customizing those shelf location lists now based on the shelf locations that you're using or plan to use. So again, we don't want you to have to wade through every library's locations to find the ones that are relevant to you. So Polaris will be limiting those to those that are of interest to your library. Coming right up on Thursday, March 15th, that's the last day to submit data or configuration issues to CCS. And I want to pause here for a minute because I do not want to imply that after March 15th, if there's a problem with your data, we're not going to fix it. We need to issue a stop on data testing so we can clear out the backlog. You guys are doing an amazing job of sending in data issues and sending in tickets, and we are working on them and working to clear them off of our list, and Polaris is as well. But we need to have some date that we say, after this date, we can't promise that's going to be fixed before Go Live. So if you find an issue on March 20th, we want to know about it, and we'll put it on a list, but it's not going to be our pre-Go Live checklist unless there's a big issue that is going to be a big problem. We know that we'll have some cleanup we have to do post-Go Live. Some of you may have tickets open with us where we've said, oh, that's a thing we can fix pretty easily with a bulk change after Go Live. So things that come in after March 15th are not lost in the ether, but may not be resolved before April 17th. So after March 15th, we have like 2 weeks basically to finish all of the data issues that are currently on our plates. We need to be able to tell Polaris that we're comfortable with the data on March 30th because they need to be able to put the next steps of the process in place. So completing data testing for libraries, we're asking by March 15th for you to have all of your issues submitted, and then CCS and Polaris will be working like mad between March 15th and March 30th to clear out all of the remaining issues that are on the log. We need to have that March 30th data review because as early as April 5th, things are starting to happen for the production server. Again, right now we're working on the training server or the test server, depending on which word we're using that day. And that server is going to be copied to become our production server. So Thursday, April 5th at 5 p.m., that's the last day to make changes to the Polaris training database that you want to see in Polaris production. So after Thursday, April 5th, you can continue to use the Polaris training database for training. But if you're changing, like if we're working in sysadmin, this is the last day that we, CCS, can make changes to system administration settings. It's the last day that in libraries you can build an item template or tweak an import profile or work on your pack customization. All of those pieces are going to be copied onto the production environment the morning of Friday, April 6th. So if on Saturday, April 7th, you're at work, it's a slow day on Saturday, and you're working on pack customization, those changes that you make will not be on the Polaris production environment at Go Live. So on Friday, April 6th, we're taking a copy of the Polaris training database as it exists that day, and that's going to become the Polaris production environment. So all of the settings, templates, import profile, pack customization, workstations, all of those pieces then are in place for the production environment, and then we wipe out the data. So we take out all the bib records, we take out all the item records, all the patrons, all the bills, and then we are going to do a fresh extraction and reload the data. So on Sunday, April 8th, after the libraries are closed, and we did learn that this is going to change from 5 p.m. to 9 p.m. So Sunday, April 8th at 9 p.m., we will be extracting the bib, item, and authority records from Symphony. And at this time, technical services downtime begins. This is our stop on cataloging. So we've extracted the bib, item, and authority records from Symphony early so we can load and process those before we have to move to offline circulation. Offline circulation really limits the amount of services we can provide to patrons. So in order to minimize that time, we do this two-step process, which does result in technical services downtime starting before circ downtime. During this time, there can be no changes, additions, or deletions for bibs, items, or authority records. This also includes changing item statuses by checking it out to an in-house card or using a wizard like Mark Item Lost or Claims Returned. All of those features impact the current location of the item, and any changes to the current location of the item made after Sunday, April 8th at 9 p.m. will not be captured and reflected in the production environment. So it would be like they never happened. If you mark an item as missing in Symphony on Monday the 9th, when we get to Tuesday the 17th, that item is not going to be marked as missing in Polaris. So again, this is technical services downtime, but it also impacts public services in terms of managing items, and the additions or changes of bibs also includes on-the-fly records. So yes, in other words, from our chat, no weeding or checkout to in-house discard during that time. That's correct. You can weed if you want to just stack those books up somewhere in your office or cubicle or workroom, but you cannot check those items out to discard during downtime. Good clarification. Okay, and then on April 13th, after the libraries close, we will do an extraction of the remaining data. So all of the circulation and patron data will be extracted from Symphony, and any transactions that happen after April 13th at 9 p.m. will need to happen in Polaris offline. And we'll do a demo of offline in a minute. This means no changes to patron records, and a lot of other sort of very specific things that we're going to talk about next. Let's see. Another question from chat. Does this mean that items checked out to an in-house, in-process card cannot be checked in after April 8th? Yes. So changing an item from in-process to available changes the location of that item. So that location, that item is already off in Polaris, getting put into the location it was in on April 8th. So any changes after April 8th to that item's location are not going to be reflected in the database. So this really affects technical services staff. Like you can't, if you're getting deliveries of items from Baker & Taylor, I mean, you can process the items, you can put the, stamp them and sticker them and get them ready, but you can't put them out on the shelf and make them available to patrons. You can't update their bib records, you can't update their item records. Additional questions about this? I will say that, again, the training database, Polaris training, will be up throughout this time. So if you're in technical services and you're wondering what you're going to do with yourself, you can work on Polaris training, but you can't be creating new things. We got another question. We cannot check anything in from April 5th on. No, that is not correct. So the question was about checking things from an in-house card or an in-process card and checking those items in to make them available to say it's not on order or in process anymore. Now it's a real item ready for checkout. That cannot happen after April 8th. You can continue to check items in, an item came back from a patron or your book drop or whatever, and you're checking it in. You can keep doing that until we start offline mode on April 13th at 9 p.m. So let's clarify this a little bit. During offline mode, which starts as soon as we extract the data on April 13th, so for most practical purposes, when you come to work on Saturday the 14th, you're going to be working in Polaris offline mode. And in Polaris offline mode, the short story is you can check materials out to patrons. And that's mostly it. But I want to work through what that actually means. So you can check out material to actual patron users, not to your in-house cards like missing or discard, because we stopped that when we started tech services downtime. But you can check things out to patrons using the offline client. If your library chooses, you may also do patron registration, but that presents some additional challenges. Patron registration, we always like to check to see if there's an existing patron. There's no patrons in Polaris offline mode for you to check against. So you would need to look them up in Symphony to see if they're an existing patron. If you choose to register patrons, there's an additional cutoff that will be Monday at 5 p.m. that we would need you to stop registering patrons, because we need to be able to load all of those patron registration files before we start the offline registration files. And this will all be covered in the documentation that is released on or before March 16th, covering offline mode. But basically, when we take our offline transactions, we need to put all the patrons that were created in first. So if they're involved in any transactions, the system knows what to do with them. So patron registration is optional and has some caveats. We cannot check in material. And the only caveat here would be if you do a big business and hourly check-ins, like you have a lot of laptops that you check out and in all day, you can do that check-in in offline mode if you want to. I would recommend taking a library card or an ID instead, just to avoid potential errors. But we cannot check in material because the system has no ability to check that barcode that you're checking in against the database to see if it needs to go in transit, if it belongs to another library, if it should be popping for a hold, if it's overdue and should bill a patron. The offline check-in can't do any of that stuff. So if you check in material all weekend long, your circ room's going to be nice and tidy and all your material is going to be on the shelf. But when we're live on Tuesday, there's no, you'll have staff that have to go find all of that material that was checked in, because now the system thinks that they're on hold for someone or it's in transit or something else. So check-in is not an option unless it's hourly material that you only use in-house that doesn't pop holds or go transit or anything else. So for ease, I would just say don't do any check-in at all. Material that is available on the hold shelf for a patron as we move into the offline period can be checked out by that patron. So if I came into your library and there was a hold for me on your hold shelf, I could check that out in the offline mode, or you could check that out to me in the offline mode, and that would be fine. But you will not be able to, as we'll talk about in the next column, do other holds management activities like expiring holds. Enterprise and Symphony will both still be up and functioning, although there will be limited functionality where we have to turn off the ability for patrons to log in to Enterprise because it's the only way we can stop them from placing holds. So Enterprise will be up for search, but will not have full functionality for holds and fine payment and all of those other pieces. Likewise, Symphony will be up and available for you to look at and search for patrons or items, but you will not be able to make any changes to patron records, item records. Anything that happens in Symphony during the offline mode is lost. It's like it never happened. So we don't want to do anything in Symphony during this period, but you may need to reference Symphony, again, to see if a patron's an existing patron or to get the call number for an item. While Enterprise and Symphony are available for you to find call number information to find out if you own the item, the statuses of items will not be accurate. If on Saturday you check out 100 books to patrons, and then on Sunday you look up those same 100 books in Symphony, they're still going to say they're on the shelf because the offline checkout does not update the status anywhere. So as we move further into the offline period and get closer to go live, the item statuses are going to become more and more out of date. We have a question that will item statuses be turned off in Enterprise? I don't know if we can do that. We will have an Enterprise banner up that notes that there's not full functionality and to check with your library, and we can note that if we cannot turn off item statuses, we can note that they are not accurate. The next question is, will SIP connections to Symphony still be functioning? And yes, database and SIP authentication will be up through the offline period, authenticating against Symphony until the change is made from Symphony to Polaris. And as we said earlier, some of those changes will be made by CCS, some of them will be made by the library, in both cases in conjunction with the vendor. The caveat here is if you register patrons during the offline period, your SIP tools are connecting to Symphony, and you've registered that patron in Polaris. So if you make a patron on Saturday morning and they're at home and they try to get into lynda.com on Sunday afternoon, the system's not going to recognize them. So SIP authentication is going to work, but it too will continue to get more outdated as we move into the offline process, including if you are registering patrons, newly registered patrons will not be in the system. And two, if a patron becomes delinquent or would have become delinquent, that information will not be picked up by SIP either because the Symphony doesn't know. The Polaris test database will also be up throughout this period, so you can continue to do training. We strongly recommend that you do not access the Polaris Test Staff Client or Polaris Test Leap on any public service computer. It's super easy to be into your training and feeling really confident, and then a patron comes up and you check an item out to them in the wrong client. So Polaris Test will be up for use at your back of house individual workstations or group training. We have a question about offline self-check that I keep getting different answers for when I ask it. So I want to get a firmer answer for you before I answer. The question is, since most circulation stations are automated, can we use self-check offline as well and work with CCS and Polaris to forward them after the new patron registration data is loaded? So When we talked to Polaris, they have said that offline circ doesn't work with self-checks, but then when we've talked to some Polaris customers, they're saying it does. So we need to do some additional testing to give a firm answer on how to manage offline with self-check stations. I'm making a note of that as well. Okay. So there's also an offline mode in sorters. This is another question from chat. We're also looking into running our sorter in offline mode so they can get a receipt if they want to. In any case, all checked-in items will be stored. Then after go live, we'll remove any offline files and then rerun all items via our sorter to check them in and have them sort properly. That sounds very interesting, and I am interested in learning more about what you're planning. So let's talk further about that, not on the webinar, and we can discuss it at our upcoming IT meeting as well. And we have another question. You guys are on fire on the chat today. I like it. Then I know you're listening. There's a lot of information on what we can and can't do on different dates. Could you make a list for the dates April 6th, 8th, and 13th like the slide below? Yes, I can. So I will add that to my list of documentation to work on for you. Can't do by dates. Yes. So let's talk a little bit about the things we can't do during offline mode. During offline mode, patron account access is off. That means for both patrons and staff, so in Enterprise or in Symphony or anywhere else, we cannot place holds, we cannot pay fines, we cannot modify patron records. In terms of processing holds, the short story is that we cannot do it. Excuse me, I have the hiccups now. We can't run the pick list because, again, we're kind of in between these two systems and there's no database that can tell us who's got holds on what. So we're not doing the pick list because even if we ran it, we can't check in material to pop a hold. So we can't receive delivery during the offline mode. We also can't check in expired holds. So if you have your hold shelf and you have a hold that would have expired on Saturday of the offline mode, you cannot, you can physically remove it from your hold shelf if you so choose, but you cannot check that item in or use the Symphony remove hold option and then pass that along to the next person. So you could just leave the items on the shelf and on the hold shelf and give patrons a couple of extra days to pick them up. We also, for libraries that are submitting close dates around the offline mode, holds will not expire on a date that Symphony thinks that you're closed. So we cannot check material in, whether it's on the hold shelf, coming in through delivery, in our Dropbox, a patron hands it to us, and we cannot make any changes to Symphony. Questions about what we can and cannot do during offline mode, with the caveat that we have to get some additional clarification around some of our automated tools. Okay. So that brings us to, can I run with scissors? No, you should never run with scissors. It is just not safe. When it comes to April 17th, what is actually going to happen on this day? We have some target times here, and I would like to emphasize that these are target times. We have some milestones with Polaris. So if, for example, we are not able to start processing offline files as soon as the libraries close on Monday night, then we will know on Monday that we're going to be delayed on Tuesday morning. Or if our bib load is still processing when our item load should be starting, we will know pretty quickly if our cushion has been eaten up and if we're going to have to go live late on Tuesday. But if everything goes to plan and fits within our time frame, as it should because we've done a time trial, our target is to go live at 7 a.m. on Tuesday. So CCS and Polaris staff will be in the office, the CCS office, starting at 6 a.m. on April 17th. We will have Polaris staff with us on the 16th, 17th, and 18th to provide additional support on site. When we get to the office bright and early, we will be checking to make sure the offline files all finished like they should have and reviewing those error logs. And then we'll start connecting, doing any additional database quality checks, and then depending on if we have any vendors in weird time zones, maybe starting to cut over some SIP tools. We have asked Governing Board to consider bringing staff in at 7 a.m.-ish on Tuesday, April 17th. It is our goal to be able to notify you all at 7 a.m. that Polaris is available for you to log in. At that time, you would log in. Your printer settings, as we've discussed before, don't carry over. So you'll want to have your cheat sheet of how you had your printers configured and check those boxes in Leap that morning. And then as soon as you're connected and you've got your receipt printer set up, you can start checking in your material. So we'll have been offline for Saturday, Sunday, and Monday, so you'll have a weekend's worth of check-ins to do. So we anticipate that that check-in process will take some time. Looking at the next couple of columns, like 8 a.m., 9 a.m., with the exception of what time you open to the public, these times are fluid. I don't expect you to stop doing material check-in at 8 a.m. to start clearing your expired holds. I am suggesting that you do all of your material check-in and you clear your expired holds and kind of clear out that backlog before you run your pick list. If you finish all of that by 8:15, you do not have to wait until 9 a.m. to run your pick list, even though the pick list is listed on the 9 a.m. column on this slide. So there will be some tasks that need to happen on Go Live in addition to materials check-in. You'll want to manage your hold shelf, get rid of those expired holds. We will send offline reports for everyone to review. If you haven't already, you'll want to update your catalog URLs and search tools on your website. And then again, both CCS and libraries will be working on cutting over SIP tools with our partner vendors. At 9 a.m., you should be able to open to the public, now operating on Polaris. CCS and Polaris staff will be available for support and troubleshooting, and you can kind of begin your regular operations. We had a question the other day, how soon after April 17th can we start cataloging? As soon as you have the all clear that you can connect to Polaris, you can start resuming your regular work. CCS and Polaris staff will be available for, Polaris staff will be available again the day before, day of, and day after Go Live. CCS staff will have extended hours during the offline period as well as the week of Go Live. So we will have staff in the office until 9 p.m. On April 17th, and then we will start to, depending on what the question volume looks like and how things are going, our goal is to sort of transition back to our after-hours answering service by the end of the week. So we will be, usually we have staff on call over the weekends and the answering service would pick up, but during offline we'll have an actual staff person answering the phone, so you don't have to go through unique management to get to CCS. So we will have that in place for evening hours as well as needed. We have another question in the chat, and this one I may need CCS staff to jump in on. Is it just the printer settings, or will the printer hardware configuration have to be reset? And I am not sure of the answer, so I'm going to pause for a minute and see if CCS staff know. We will check with Polaris because we are not sure. We know that the sort of like checkboxes in LEAP have to be reconfigured. We haven't really discussed, because we did ask you to send in your like hardware specifications for us to put in the client, but we're not sure that both of those pieces will have to be updated, so we'll get back to everyone on that. And we'll have an answer. We'll share the answer as soon as we get it, but we'll also go over it again at the IT meeting coming up. We have another question. Will we have to reinstall the client on the morning of April 17th as well? Probably to maybe is the answer to that question. The remote app should automatically update when there's new information for it to gather, such as a link to the production environment. Internally in the office, we haven't had great luck with that. We've had to update that. So I've asked Marcin to put together some steps to take if you're using sort of a tool to deploy software out to all of your workstations, or if you're working individually at each station, what you would have to do. The installation process, the uninstall and reinstall, is really like a right click and a click, so it shouldn't be too onerous if you do have to. Theoretically, the answer is no, it should update, but we haven't been seeing those updates come through as we would expect. So I would suggest planning to do a reinstall, and we'll have that documentation out as soon as possible, definitely before the IT meeting. That's a great question, and that came up yesterday, and that is why it is not on my slide yet. So thank you, Sarah. Additional questions? Okay. So after go live, CCS, we're going to take a 3-month vacation, and you guys will all be on your own. It's been nice knowing you. That is not true, and jokes don't work great on webinars, is what I just learned. So after go live, CCS will be doing some additional training, which I'll talk about on my next slide. We'll also be kind of getting back in the regular routine of library visits. We will be working with libraries on additional PAC customization. We talked about web reports, and we talked about community profiles and feature it. So even though like technically the migration happens on April 17th, we have a lot going on after that, including some additional training sessions. So this is our training sort of plan for public services, and the next slide is for technical services, between April and June. And then we'll also, in a couple of weeks, be releasing a sort of rough outline for training July onward. So we know that you have staff turnover, maybe you got a new manager or assistant manager or just a bunch of staff and you want to kind of refresh. So we'll be offering sessions for circulation. We'll be offering separate past sessions. We'll be doing statistical reports and Simply reports. We have this session called like Working with Polaris Fields, is sort of like, we're working on a better title, but understanding how the different elements of Polaris work together to accomplish the same things that we're used to from Symphony. We'll have a follow-up PAC customization webinar. We will be offering a couple of sessions on power searching and SQL basics for library staff if you want to take your search in Polaris to the next level. And again, community profiles and feature it. For technical services, we'll be offering some technical services training sessions. We'll also be doing an acquisitions like technical group meeting, sharing session before the start of the July 1 fiscal year. Based on the survey results we've received so far, we have a number of libraries that are adding to or changing their acquisitions practices. And we want to give everybody an opportunity to kind of get together and talk about what their plans are and learn from libraries who have maybe already done some Polaris setup. So those dates are coming out shortly. We'll also be working with each library individually who will be moving forward with a change to acquisitions as needed. And those may be in-person visits or conference calls depending on the needs of the library and CCS scheduling. So we are looking forward to seeing the process changes that you're putting in place and helping make sure that those get off the ground smoothly. Additional questions about training or post-go live? Yes, cataloging. Oh, thank you. So I have a missing bullet point. Whoops. So there are two separate sessions. There's a technical service session or training that we'll have 3 sessions of, and we'll cover find tool, record sets, SQL searches, power searches, Polaris Label Manager. And then there is a cataloging training that we'll have 3 sessions of that will cover merging records, import profiles, electronic resource loading, and authorities. I have an indent issue here. Thank you, CCS staff. And then acquisitions is separate as well. Okay. If there are no additional questions, I will move on to our offline demo, but I want to pause for a minute here and give you a chance, if you were typing and listening, to focus on typing. Okay. So okay, so the offline demo should be pretty easy. You will open the same icon that you've been working with. And it will ask you to log into the terminal server. So when we're in migration offline mode, we're going to log on to the terminal server just like you would for any other day accessing the staff client. And right now I'm getting a note that this is the training server, which I'm fine with because I'm in offline mode, and my offline file is going to go onto my terminal server right where I want it. I'm still going to put in my username, but instead of adding my password and pressing OK like I always do, I'm going to check work offline, and then I'm going to press OK. So far, so good. In circulation, you can see that most of my options are grayed out. You will notice that the check-in option is not grayed out. If I could just turn that off for all libraries, I would, but I'm not able to permission things in offline mode because, again, in offline mode, there's really no database that it's checking against. So I'm going to assume that I understand that I cannot do check-in, and I'm going to open my check-out window. So we've said in some previous documentation that it's important for library patrons to bring their actual library card in during offline mode. And that is, one, because there's no patron lookup option. I just have the patron barcode field. So if you do look up a patron, you're looking them up in Symphony. And 2, if I key in, I can key in any number I want here and press enter, and it's going to act like I'm a regular patron. So if I'm trying to key in a 14-digit barcode and I miss a 0 or I transpose 2 numbers, it's going to take it and it's not going to give me any error message. So the safest way to make sure that you're reducing your errors is to always use the barcode scanner during offline mode to scan the patron barcode, and the same for item barcodes. So here I've inputted an erroneous barcode. It doesn't mean anything, but let's pretend it's a real barcode. I can then start scanning in my item barcodes. And when I scan in my item barcodes, it's going to automatically assign my library's default loan period. So the default loan period could vary library to library, and that's in your Polaris settings, but it's in most cases, what your books check out for. So if I have a stack of books and I just want to check them all out, I can just put them in. And again, you'll see that it's letting me put in whatever I want right now, and assigning a due date for us that is in 2 weeks. If I come up to you with a stack of books with a couple of DVDs, my recommendation is that you do all the books first, and then if you would like to assign maybe a 1-week loan period for DVDs, you can use the special option here to set your next loan period. So for I can say make the loan period 7 days. I don't want to apply it to the next item only because my patron has 3 DVDs with them. I can say apply to all items for this patron, and this is going to be to all future items for this patron. So I'm going to press OK, and then you can see I put in barcode 4 and barcode 5, and it's giving me a different due date for those additional checkouts that I'm doing, and my 7-day checkout has stayed in here. Maybe someone grabs a book off your display and they want to add it to their pile after you've changed the special due date. You can hit reset, and then it'll go back to default here. So there's that. Again, you can see it's not giving me any name or registered information because I don't have any good options. Like, I don't have anything to check it against. We have a question about if we extend our due dates until May 1st or whatever date that you've selected, will that be reflected in offline? No. So the offline mode is just pulling that default checkout period. If you want to set a special loan, you can apply it to all checkouts. You can pick a specific date, or you can, again, put in days, hours, minutes as needed and set it that way. The close dates in Symphony will prevent items checked out in Symphony from coming due on any of those days, but it will not have an effect in Polaris. Okay. So if I wanted to, I don't have a printer configured, which was a mistake on my end, but I could print the receipt for patrons so they have their due dates here. They're, of course, not going to show up on the patron's My Account until after the database is loaded and the offline files are processed, but then they will show up on My Account and they'll be able to check out and renew, etc. Your other option is to register patrons if you choose to do so, and that's under Patron Services under Patron Records. So here you can see, again, I have no option to look up if this is an existing patron. Like when I pull up Patron Records, I can't search for patrons in any way. So you would fill out the fields as you normally would. Filling out all of the required fields, setting your expiration date, setting their notice preference. You can assign them the barcode. It's like the account will be registered in full when the offline files process. But again, any patron registered here will not have access to SIP tools until these offline files are loaded. We have a couple of questions. Have the close dates been put into Polaris, or will they? We were not anticipating putting the close dates into Polaris, but if that is something a library wants to do, we can do that. I don't know. Could this offline mode be used from now on if something goes wrong with Leap? Yes, so when we're live on Polaris, you'll use offline if you do not have internet connectivity or if we have some sort of problem with the server. It will be a little bit, close dates in general, close dates in general have been put into Polaris just for the migration, like if a special close date has not been put in. But like your holiday schedule, those were put in at the time of profiling, and we'll continue to update them for future closed times. So when I logged into offline mode here, I logged into the terminal server first, and then my offline file is going to be dropped onto the terminal server, and like onto the Polaris server, and Polaris staff are going to go in and get it and process it. In regular operations, if you need to use offline mode, it is because either you can't connect to the terminal server because you don't have internet, or the terminal server can't connect to you because it's down. So in that case, the offline mode is going to look the same, but there is a separate tool. There's a separate icon that you'll use to open it, because if you try to open the regular icon you always use, it's going to try to connect to the terminal server, and it's going to say there's no connection to the terminal server, and you won't ever get to this stage. So during regular non-migration offline mode, it's the same client, it looks the same, it's just going to be installed locally on your machine instead of on the Polaris server. Are there additional questions about what can or cannot happen in offline mode or anything else? Yes, so for the migration, we will be using the terminal server's version. Yes, during Polaris offline mode for the migration, you will log on to the terminal server with your terminal server login, and then you will, when the client logon pops up, you will select use offline mode. And that will ensure that we get all of the offline files as soon as possible without losing any data. Because again, the files will be built like on the terminal server rather than on your own machine. This is a short demo because there's literally only 2 things you can do. Okay. That brings us to the end of our agenda. So there are more questions. Oh, for placing holds for patrons, our library is doing something separate on our own. So if I'm understanding this question correctly, it's, is there anything we can do for patrons who may want to place holds during offline mode? The official CCS word or recommendation is that during offline mode, we cannot make any modifications to patron accounts, so we do not recommend placing holds. That's the official CCS word. We do know that some libraries continue to accept hold requests from their patrons, and they keep a separate record of them and then manually input them later. That certainly could create some confusion around, I placed this hold on Saturday, why does my hold place date say Wednesday? Depending on the volume you have, how much work it's going to be for you. But there are some libraries that sort of manually track hold information and then fill that stuff out later. Northbrook has noted that they have previously used a Google form or plan to do so in the future, and they're happy to share if anyone is interested. I have another question about offline. It says to go to the next patron, you have to close and open. Can you show that, please? Yeah, so when I'm done checking out to a patron, I just close the window and then I can reopen it and do checkout. The same thing here. I can put in we'll just say that's what I'm going to do. I have to put in an email address. Let's see. So here I've saved my record, and if I want to, it cleared out after I saved it, so I could keep going. In checkout, I close and reopen. If you close the checkout screen, will you have to reset the special due date? Yes. Let's see. Not 7 minutes. Yes. You will have to reset the special due date. Unless I'm missing something, and then CCS staff can jump in. They're not jumping in. So if you have further questions, I'm happy to stick around. Other than that, if you feel your questions have been answered and you're just anxiously awaiting documentation and additional updates, thank you for your time and for logging in today. We will finish this recording and post it, and you can share it with your colleagues who were not able to make it, and it will be thrilling viewing for all. So thank you, everyone.